Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, this is one that was suggested to me in our video suggestions over on Discord. It's from a channel called The Odd Historian who has 2,000 subscribers. Always fun to look at a new channel, one that maybe people haven't discovered yet and see what they have to offer. This one's called History's Overrated Generals. I've done some talking here and there about generals that I think are overrated over time, so I'll be interested to see who he has to say, who he feels are the overrated generals. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check out not only this video without my commentary, but anything else that the Odd Historian has to offer. And at the end, we'll see if this is a channel worth checking out more in the future. Let's dive in.
History is filled with celebrated generals, but not all deserve their fame. Many owe their reputations to propaganda, luck, or the efforts of others rather than their own brilliance. A closer examination of their careers challenges the perception of their greatness. George Washington is often voted amongst the United States' greatest generals, and is often regarded as a military genius.
I wouldn't say he's always regarded that way, but I think there's definitely that impression among many Americans that George Washington was a great general, and he wasn't at all.
But is that reputation deserved? Washington's first notable success was the conclusion of the Siege of Boston in March 1776. By fortifying Dorchester Heights with artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga, Washington forced the British to evacuate the city. But this was Colonel Knox's idea, and it was his incredible logistical effort that moved 60 tons of cannon and armaments through difficult terrain to get to Boston.
Yeah, so Henry Knox is this, I think he was from Boston, bookkeeper, who's a pretty heavy-set guy, ends up being our first Secretary of War in Washington's administration. And yeah, he's 100% responsible for getting those cannon there. Washington ends up negotiating a settlement in which he allows the British to retreat out of Boston by sea in exchange for not burning the city to the ground.
Washington's first real test was the Battle of Long Island in August 1776.
It was a mess.
Washington's army was outmaneuvered by the British General William Howe, who executed a flanking attack that forced the Continental Army to retreat.
And not only does he execute a flanking attack brilliantly, he uses a maneuver that's going to be used again and again against Washington, not only in this campaign in 1776, but later on at places like Brandywine.
Despite the loss, Washington's leadership ensured the army's survival, retreating across the East River under the cover of night and avoiding total destruction.
Washington's really good at the Fabian tactic, the pull back and survive, but for the most part when he stands and fights, he gets his butt kicked. And yes, part of that is because he's facing the British, and he's doing it with a ragtag force. And Washington is a phenomenal leader. He's a great leader. He's not a great general.
Similarly, at the Battle of Brandywine in September 1777, Washington again fell victim to a British flanking maneuver, resulting in a crushing defeat and a British capture of Philadelphia. Despite these losses, Washington's focus remained on...
And by the way, these are clips, like right now what we're seeing, that's John Andre on the right there. This is from Turn, Washington's Spies, which is so good. It's really, really good, and you should watch it.
In the army, he understood that as long as his forces remained intact, the revolution could continue. What Washington lacked in tactical expertise, he more than compensated for it with exceptional leadership.
I agree.
Few generals...
100%. I could not agree with him more on what he's saying right now.
Could have maintained a Continental Army's resolve and cohesion, ensuring it survived to fight another day. But falling for two diversionary attacks while leaving your flanks exposed is not the quality of an excellent general.
Agree.
He did achieve a major victory early in the war. In December 1776,
Trenton.
after crossing the Delaware River, Washington launched a surprise attack on the Hessian mercenaries who were caught off guard in their winter quarters.
Trenton was absolutely brilliant. It was done against the better judgment of some of Washington's other generals, and he followed that up with other successes at places like Princeton. I'm not going to take that away from Washington. I'm not going to say he didn't have successes. Trenton is brilliant. Princeton is brilliant. Monmouth, he pulls, the way they describe it in Hamilton is that they snatch a stalemate from the jaws of defeat, which is absolutely true. But there's just not a resume there that says brilliant general.
This victory boosted the Continental Congress's confidence, demonstrating that colonial forces could triumph over the British. It also led to a surge in re-enlistments, strengthening the ranks of the Continental Army. This was a victory that was sorely needed as morale was faltering. But there was also an element of luck. Had the Hessian commander heeded the warnings from his scouts, it could have been a disaster for Washington.
And remember too that all of the Hessian commanders, all the colonels at Trenton were killed in this battle. Americans don't lose a single man killed. There's a couple of deaths from exposure during all of it, but there's no battle deaths. The closest anybody comes is James Monroe, who nearly dies but is saved by a surgeon.
The year of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge marked a turning point for the Continental Army. While Washington's leadership held the army together during this brutal period, it was the arrival of Baron von Steuben that transformed the troops into a more effective fighting force. Von Steuben, a former Prussian officer, implemented rigorous training regimes, drilled the soldiers in European-style tactics, and standardized procedures.
And he's the namesake of, I think there's some counties, Steuben counties or Steuben counties. Steubenville, Ohio, as we call it, is named after Baron von Steuben.
These reforms gave the Continental Army the professionalism it previously had lacked and what Washington was unable to supply. The Northern Campaign effectively ended with the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. A decisive American victory fought not by Washington, but by Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. This battle forced the British to shift their strategy to the Southern Campaign, where they hoped to rally loyalist support. It was also the battle that ushered the French into the war, and was perhaps the most important battle of the Revolutionary War. The Southern Campaign devolved into a brutal civil war. The British Army won Pyrrhic victories like the Battle of Guilford Courthouse under the command of Nathaniel Greene, with other Southern commanders
who I would argue might be the best American general in the Revolution, Nathaniel Greene,
earning victories like the Battle of Kings Mountain and the Battle of Cowpens. However, Washington did appoint Nathaniel Greene as the commander in charge of the Southern Continental Forces.
And this is something Washington's really good at. He's really good at recognizing talent in others, and he wanted Nathaniel Greene to go south sooner, but he was overruled by the Continental Congress, who put Horatio Gates in charge. Gates loses an absolute debacle of a battle at Camden, and it's only then that they put Greene in charge.
This showcases one of Washington's other impressive talents. He could identify able and effective officers.
Yep.
But it was those commanders that turned back the British victories in the South.
So again, I would agree that Washington is a great leader, and I'm not taking away from that. Washington's a great leader. He was a great president. He inspired people. He just was not a great tactician. He was not a great general in the traditional sense of winning battles because of your superior tactics, like a Napoleon Bonaparte, for example.
Washington returned to prominence during the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, where his leadership played a critical role in coordinating the final blow to British forces. However, this success was heavily reliant on the contributions of others.
The French.
The French Navy blockaded the British, cutting off their supply lines, while American and French ground forces besieged Yorktown. The British surrender marked the effective end of the war, though it was as much a triumph of Allied cooperation as it was of Washington's leadership.
Yeah, and Washington didn't even want to go to Yorktown, and those are scenes from the movie The Patriot. Washington wanted to take on the British in New York City. And if he had gotten his way in that, I don't know if things turn out the same way. The French had to convince Washington to go after Cornwallis at Yorktown.
Washington's military record, when examined critically, reveals few outright battlefield successes. The majority of his battles ended in defeat. Yet his greatest strength was his ability to endure those losses and maintain the Continental Army as a viable fighting force. Washington's charisma and resolve inspired loyalty among his men, who endured years of hardship under his command. His ability to navigate the political complexities of Congress and secure the necessary support ensured the revolution did not collapse. Washington was not a military genius in the mold of Napoleon or Alexander the Great. His strengths lay in his leadership, his strategic understanding of the broader war effort, and his ability to identify excellent officers and delegate effectively. Washington's military ability is often overrated, likely because he ultimately won the war and went on to become the first president of the United States, a nation he played a pivotal role in securing. This isn't to say Washington was a bad general, far from it. He was a capable and resourceful leader, but not a great tactician or a military genius. However, he was probably the right leader at the right time.
I think that was an incredibly fair and accurate assessment of George Washington. I'm very, very impressed by his take on all of that, both in terms of Washington's strengths, but also his weaknesses. So if that's any indication of where we're going with this, then I have pretty high hopes at the moment.
Erwin Rommel, aka the Desert Fox, occupies a unique place in military history. Known for his daring tactics and his ability to outmaneuver his opponents, Rommel's name has become synonymous with battlefield brilliance. However, beneath the carefully cultivated myth lies a more nuanced reality. While Rommel excelled as a tactical commander, his operational shortcomings, disregard for logistics, reveal him to be an overrated figure.
First of all, I agree with him. I think Rommel's absolutely overrated, and I think that Rommel falls into the category much like a Stonewall Jackson does, where because he died in the middle of the war, well, not in the middle, but toward the end of the war, but he died before it was over. There's that what if, and there's that question of, he's kind of the martyr figure. And I think another reason with Rommel is that because he is viewed today as being associated with the July plot against Hitler in 1944, some people see him as the German that it's kind of okay to like a little bit, because maybe we see him as not being a diehard Nazi like so many of the other ones.
Rommel's tactical ingenuity cannot be denied. During the North African campaign, his ability to achieve rapid victories with limited resources earned him widespread acclaim. His counteroffensive at the Battle of Gazala in May 1942, culminating in the capture of Tobruk, stands as a testament to his skill in exploiting weaknesses in enemy lines.
Yeah, he's very, very good, but I think some people have him on this high pedestal that is somehow he wasn't even the best general in his own army, let alone in World War II.
Using fast-moving panzer divisions and coordinating assaults, Rommel confounded British forces, who often underestimated his capacity for daring maneuvers. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in early 1943 further showcased Rommel's tactical brilliance. Facing inexperienced American forces...
I was going to say, Kasserine Pass is more about how bad the Americans were, guys like Friedenthal, than it is about how great Rommel was.
Rommel swiftly exploited gaps in their defenses, inflicting heavy casualties. These victories underscored his ability to think quickly and decisively on the battlefield, earning him respect from both allies and adversaries. However, tactical brilliance alone does not win wars. For all his battlefield flair, Rommel consistently failed to align his actions with broader strategic objectives. His inability to grasp the bigger picture undermined the successes he achieved on the ground.
And I will say, to a degree, we can't blame Rommel for that completely, because he wasn't the general-in-chief, right? He wasn't the Führer. He wasn't the one making those bigger decisions in many scenarios.
This weakness was particularly evident in his overextension following the capture of Tobruk. Instead of consolidating his gains and preparing for a prolonged campaign, Rommel pushed toward Egypt, culminating in the Battle of El Alamein.
Yeah, and he got his butt kicked by the British there. I agree with him on this. I think that the greatest strength for a Rommel is also his greatest weakness, and you could probably say the same thing about someone like Patton. The daring, the go get 'em, the plow forward at all costs can be very helpful if you have people above you that know when to rein you in. And I think that's why Patton was as successful as he was, is because Patton was never in the situation where he could just run roughshod without any kind of consequence. He always had those people above him to rein him in.
At El Alamein, Rommel's inability to coordinate his forces and account for logistical constraints proved disastrous. In North Africa, where supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of hostile desert, logistical planning was critical. Yet Rommel often ignored the practical realities of sustaining his forces. Facing a well-prepared British defence under General Bernard Montgomery, Rommel's exhausted troops and depleted supplies stood little chance. His decision to press forward despite the precariousness of his position highlights his poor judgment at the operational level. El Alamein was not merely a tactical setback, it was a strategic defeat that marked the turning point in the North African campaign.
And that was going to happen eventually regardless, because of the arrival of the Americans, and now you're kind of coming in from both sides, but it probably sped the process up a little bit.
Rommel's aggressive, independent style led to clashes with German high command and strained relations with his Italian allies. His unauthorized push toward Egypt and frequent criticism of the Italian army fostered resentment, undermining coordination in North Africa. These tensions and distrust highlighted his limitations as a commander. The myth of Rommel as an unparalleled military genius was not merely the product of his battlefield exploits. German propaganda played a significant role in elevating his reputation.
Yeah.
In the early years of the war...
And you could probably say that about any general in history. There's definitely a level of propaganda, but in some cases the propaganda is based more on reality than others.
Germany portrayed Rommel as a heroic figure embodying the virtues of the German soldier: courage, innovation, and determination. This narrative was leaned into significantly with the victories in Africa as it distracted from Germany's faltering campaign in Russia. British propaganda also contributed to the Rommel myth, albeit for different reasons. By portraying Rommel as a formidable opponent, the British were able to deflect attention from their own shortcomings in the early stages of the North African campaign.
Yeah, he's really good, which is why we struggled early. But then in the end, we beat him, which means we're even better. That's how it goes.
The defeats of Gazala and the Kasserine Pass, while embarrassing, could be reframed as the inevitable result of facing a military genius. This narrative not only excused British failings, but also amplified Montgomery's eventual victory at El Alamein, which was presented as a triumph over a near-invincible adversary. The reality, however, was far less glamorous. While Rommel did display his tactical acumen, to be a true great general, one must be strategically and even politically sound. And this is where Rommel faltered, and he does not deserve the reputation as a military great.
And so far, I have to agree with both of them. And in each case, he's not saying these aren't really good generals or that they haven't had really good victories or good moments. He's just saying that maybe the reputation that they have is not altogether justified.
Speaking of Rommel's opponent, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, widely celebrated in his time, remains a polarizing figure in military history. Often hailed for his massive victory at El Alamein and his leadership during the campaigns in Italy and Northern Europe, Montgomery's legacy has been scrutinized for his shortcomings ranging from strategic failures to interpersonal conflicts. Montgomery is best known for his victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, an engagement that was a turning point in the North African campaign.
In fact, I think that Montgomery, when he was given a title, it involved El Alamein as part of his title.
Allies ultimately triumphed. The circumstances surrounding this victory reveal significant caveats. Montgomery took command of the British 8th Army when the German Afrika Korps, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was already struggling. German forces were exhausted, hampered by overstretched supply lines and a lack of reinforcements as German High Command prioritized the Eastern Front. Montgomery spent months building up overwhelming superiority in artillery, tanks, and air power. Despite these advantages and a numerical edge in manpower, it still took him 15 days of intense fighting to break through the German-Italian defenses.
Now, I will say this in Montgomery's defense, and I can't believe I'm defending Montgomery because I'm not a huge fan of his, but just because he came in at a time when the Germans were already past their peak, and just because it took him a little bit of time to get up to speed on things, does not in and of itself negate the idea that Bernard Montgomery was a great general.
With the Allies suffering significant losses, his cautious style meant he was unwilling to exploit successes unless he was assured of victory, often given time for the Germans to regroup.
So he's the opposite of a Patton in that sense, but I don't think that was always the case. I don't think Montgomery was always a overly cautious person. I mean, Market Garden was his baby, and that was ridiculously ambitious. It was too ambitious.
His role in the Normandy invasion in June 1944 is another area of contention. Tasked with capturing Caen by D-Day or D-Day+2, Montgomery failed to meet this critical objective. The city did not fall until July 19th, over a month after the invasion.
But Montgomery was in charge of all ground forces at that point, and Caen was not his only objective, and none of the objectives got taken as quickly as we thought they would. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that are not simply on Montgomery. So far, I'm not entirely sure I agree with his reasoning.
Following a series of failed attacks that resulted in tens of thousands of British and Canadian casualties. The delays allowed German forces to fortify their positions, further stalling the Allied advance. His lack of foresight and rigid tactics contrasted sharply with the more dynamic American approach, exemplified by General George Patton's breakout in the West, which ultimately set the stage for the Allied advance through France.
Yeah, but Patton didn't come into the fighting until after all of these initial moments. Patton was on the sidelines, and he comes in later on after they're starting to break out.
Montgomery later claimed that delaying German forces in Caen to facilitate Patton's breakout in the West was part of his master plan. However, if this were true, his superior Eisenhower was not aware of it. More likely, this was a post hoc justification for his failure to achieve
which people do a lot.
Montgomery's most famous failure was Operation Market Garden in September 1944. This ambition,
And this is exactly one of those moments in history where, had it been successful, everyone would be praising Montgomery for being the genius that brought an early end to the war. Instead, we say what a colossal failure it was, and it cost us what might have otherwise been an early end to the war. So, I agree, Market Garden is a huge stain on Montgomery's reputation, but it does fly directly in the face of the idea that Montgomery was an overly cautious commander.
plan aimed to seize key bridges in the Netherlands and enable a rapid Allied advance into Germany. However, it was poorly conceived and executed. Montgomery underestimated German resistance, ignored significant logistical challenges, and diverted critical resources from other sectors of the front to support his plan. This left other Allied operations under-resourced and slowed progress elsewhere.
That said, Eisenhower signed off on it. Now, granted, you can argue that Eisenhower signed off on it because of political concerns, because he had to appease the British, because he was the overall commander, and Montgomery was under him, and this was Montgomery's idea, and there was the argument that they needed to get at the rocket launch sites that were terrorizing the UK. So there's all those factors, but in the end, Eisenhower signed off on it.
The operation ended in disaster, with Allied airborne forces suffering heavy casualties and failing to achieve their objectives. The failure of Market Garden had severe consequences. It prolonged the war in the Netherlands, leaving much of the country under German occupation during a harsh winter of 44-45. Thousands of Dutch civilians died of starvation during what would become known as the Hunger Winter. In early 1945, Montgomery led another massive airborne operation, Operation Varsity, to cross the Rhine. Involving 16,000 men, it was the largest airborne operation on a single day in one location. But it was probably a completely unnecessary operation.
Yeah, and if you go to, if you've seen my video that I did at the Reichswald Forest War Cemetery, in fact, I'll put a link in the description for that video so you can check it out. You'll see entire sections of that cemetery with the exact same death date, all of them airborne troops.
American forces already secured bridgeheads at Rommel and Fort South. Actual crossings of the Rhine by waterborne forces were achieved with relative ease, aided by heavy smoke screens that masked their movements. The operation took place during daylight, resulting in high casualty rates, especially among glider crews. Of the 416 gliders involved, only 88 emerged unscathed, with around 25% of glider pilots either killed or wounded. Operation Varsity, a component of the larger Operation Plunder, which involved over 1,200,000 troops, accounted for a disproportionate share of the losses. Despite comprising of just 16,000 men, Varsity contributed to approximately 40% of overall casualties. Montgomery was undoubtedly a capable commander with significant achievements, but his reputation as one of World War II's greatest generals is debatable. His victories often relied on overwhelming material superiority, and his cautious methodological approach limited his ability to achieve decisive results.
Yeah, so again, I would say Montgomery, very good general. One of the best generals on the Allied side. Great. In the conversation for all-time greats, not even close.
Montgomery's post-war reputation has been bolstered by his own skillful self-promotion. He often claimed credit for Allied successes while downplaying his failures and the contributions of others. For instance, he portrayed himself as the architect of the Allied breakout from Normandy, despite the pivotal role played by American forces in Operation Cobra. While Montgomery remains a celebrated figure in Britain, his legacy is far less favourable in other parts of Europe and among his American allies. The Dutch in particular bear the scars of Market Garden's failure, and many American commanders viewed him as a liability whose rigid approach and self-aggrandizing tendencies led to unnecessary losses and sapped limited resources away from more worthwhile endeavours.
Although I think you could argue a lot of those same things about Patton, and I think sometimes Patton maybe gets a little bit oversold too.
Douglas MacArthur, one of the most prominent military figures of the 20th century, remains a polarizing figure in history.
Not good.
His name is often associated with triumphant campaigns in the Pacific theater of World War II and the post-war reconstruction of Japan. However, a closer examination of his career reveals significant flaws that challenge this status. While MacArthur possessed undeniable charisma and a flair for theatrics, his strategic missteps, insubordination, and ego-driven decisions paint a picture of an overrated general whose myth often eclipses his true legacy.
I never understood the high praise for MacArthur. I never understood that at all. Never even thought he was that good. I just don't get it.
One of MacArthur's most glaring failures came early in World War II with the defense of the Philippines. Despite clear warnings of an imminent Japanese attack, MacArthur's response was slow and ineffective. His failure to disperse aircraft left much of his air force destroyed on the ground within hours of the initial Japanese assault. His defensive strategy, relying on a rigid plan to hold the island of Luzon, quickly unraveled. Instead of adopting a flexible, mobile defense, MacArthur allowed his forces to be pushed back to the Bataan Peninsula, where they endured months of suffering in a hopeless siege. Ultimately, MacArthur abandoned his troops, retreating to Australia under orders from President Roosevelt, while famously vowing, "I shall return." The soldiers he left behind faced the horrors of the Bataan Death March, a consequence of MacArthur's inadequate preparations and strategic misjudgment.
Yeah.
Another one of MacArthur's significant missteps during the Pacific Campaign was the insistence on the invasion of Peleliu in September 1944. Ostensibly intended to secure an airfield to support the operations in the Philippines, the island had little strategic value by the time the invasion commenced.
And the unfortunate reality here is that because he had the early missteps in the Philippines, and because he did say, "I shall return," and he was a big PR guy, and he was always worried about how things looked, I think that affected his judgment. I think that his strategy, now granted, he was not the only, he was not the end-all, be-all, overall commander of all Allied forces in the Pacific. But in the area that he was responsible for, I think he was affected in his judgment by this desire to get back to the Philippines.
US forces had already achieved air superiority in the region, and Peleliu's airfield was marginally useful at best. MacArthur predicted fighting would last 4 days, but it took over 2 months to secure the island. It was probably the most intense battle of the war for the Americans. It was characterized by fierce Japanese resistance and brutal fighting, resulting in approximately 10,000 American casualties. MacArthur's boldest moment came during the Korean War with the amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950. The operation, a risky maneuver that involved landing behind North Korean lines, was a stunning tactical success.
Yeah.
It turned the tide of the war, forcing North Korean forces into retreat and recapturing Seoul. However, his triumph at Incheon also emboldened his worst tendencies. Convinced of his own invincibility, MacArthur ignored warnings about Chinese intervention and pushed his forces dangerously close to the Yalu River, the border with China. His hubris led to a catastrophic
Yeah, and then he wanted us to use nukes.
counteroffensive in late 1950, which drove UN forces into a desperate retreat and turned the Korean War into a prolonged stalemate. MacArthur's refusal to heed intelligence and his overconfidence in his ability to intimidate China cost countless lives and undermined his earlier successes. His decision also contravened direct orders from Truman. Truman hoped to use MacArthur's success to negotiate a peace plan and end the war quickly.
Right.
Truman's decision to relieve MacArthur in April 1951 was one of the most controversial moments of the war. His behavior demonstrated that despite his military prowess, MacArthur was unwilling or unable to operate within the boundaries of democratic governance.
And then he explored just running for president so he could just do what he wanted anyway.
It wasn't the first time he disobeyed orders. One of the darkest episodes of MacArthur's career occurred in 1932 during the Bonus Army protests. Thousands of World War I veterans, struggling through the Great Depression, marched on Washington, D.C. to demand early payment of service bonuses. President Herbert Hoover ordered their peaceful removal and told MacArthur not to cross the Anacostia River. Instead, he escalated the operation, deploying cavalry, tanks, and infantry to forcibly evict
and I believe Patton was one of the soldiers that was involved in being deployed in all of that by MacArthur.
protesters. Troops used tear gas and bayonets to drive veterans and their families from their encampments, which were then set ablaze. The violent suppression shocked the nation.
Yep.
MacArthur remained unapologetic, a trait that would become a recurring theme throughout his career as he consistently refused to accept the responsibility of his actions. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of MacArthur's legacy is the cult of personality that surrounded him. A master of self-promotion,
Yep.
MacArthur cultivated an image of infallibility that has persisted long after his death. From his pipe and aviator glasses to his carefully staged photographs, MacArthur understood the power of symbolism in shaping public perception. However, this carefully crafted image often obscures his flaws. His failures in the Philippines, the needless costly lives of Peleliu, his reckless decisions in Korea, and his defiance of civilian authority highlight significant flaws that undermine his reputation as a military genius. MacArthur disobeyed orders when it suited his pursuit of personal glory,
Yep.
often disregarding the broader political ramifications. The one time he did obey orders when he shouldn't have was when he was ordered to abandon his men in the Philippines, because defiance offered no opportunity for personal acclaim. These decisions underscore the self-serving nature of MacArthur's character.
He makes a good point. Now, I would argue that it was good that MacArthur obeyed orders, but I agree with him that of all the times MacArthur didn't obey orders, that would have been the time to do it. But yeah, I agree. I never understood the praise for MacArthur. Oh, I can see where this one's going, and I already agree.
Robert E. Lee, often celebrated as a brilliant general and a paragon of Southern honor, occupies a controversial and arguably inflated place in the annals of American history. His legacy, bolstered by the romanticized narratives of the Lost Cause, portrays him as a strategic genius and a noble man.
Again, really good general who had a lot of success against really bad generals. Doesn't mean he's not a good general, but again, overrated? Absolutely. The way we celebrate him as like being the greatest general in American history and one of the greatest generals of all time is absurd to me.
However, a closer examination of his military career reveals a much less flattering picture. In reality, his shortcomings, both as a general and as a historical figure, highlight the ways in which his reputation has been overrated through a combination of myth-making and selective memory. Lee's courage and tactical audacity are undeniable, as evidenced by victories like the 7 Days Battles, Second Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. However, these successes were often aided by his opponent's shortcomings.
100%.
At 7 Days, McClellan's excessive caution undermined Union efforts.
Lee should have never even gotten command of that army because Richmond should have fallen before Lee even got command of what became the Army of Northern Virginia. The fact that it didn't is already a testimony to how god-awful George McClellan was in the Peninsula Campaign.
Pope's overconfidence at Second Manassas left him vulnerable to Lee's maneuvers. Burnside's logistical mismanagement turned Fredericksburg into a disaster for the Union, while Hooker's loss of nerve at Chancellorsville allowed Lee to seize the advantage.
All true. I mean, even after Stonewall Jackson's brilliant flanking maneuver sees great success at Chancellorsville was a very winnable battle for the Union, and it only didn't happen because of Hooker losing his nerve and getting his bell rung.
Triumphs, though impressive, were frequently facilitated by his adversaries' critical failures.
Yep.
Even in his victories, Lee's methods were often short-sighted. His preference for offensive battles strained Confederate resources and manpower, a critical mistake given the South's limited reserves.
Yep.
Historians have pointed out that a more defensive strategy, leveraging the South's familiarity with its own terrain, might have prolonged the war and increased the likelihood of a negotiated peace.
Which was the only way the South could win. The South was never going to win the Civil War by invading the North and forcing them to come to the negotiating table. I say this all the time. If Lee had won at Gettysburg, it would have changed nothing, because there was a massive number of Union troops that were converging on southern Pennsylvania. And if Lee had, let's say that everything happened exactly the way it did at Gettysburg, but on the third day, he breaks Union lines during Pickett's charge and they're forced to retreat. Well, now, Lee's army, which was 75,000, is now down under 50,000 because of the casualties. Meade still has a good 80,000 men on the field. There's another 50 to 100,000 men within a couple of days' march that can show up, and Lee will suddenly be outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. I might even argue that it would have been worse for Lee if he had won the Battle of Gettysburg. Invading the North was never a solid idea.
Instead, Lee's relentless offensives led to a steady erosion of the Confederate Army's strength, contributing significantly to its ultimate defeat. His most infamous blunder, the Battle of Gettysburg, exemplifies this recklessness. In July 1863, Lee launched an ill-advised invasion of the North, culminating in a disastrous Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. On the third day of the battle, Lee ordered his troops to advance across open field, fully exposed to devastating Union artillery and rifle fire. This decision was made despite the strong objections of his subordinates, who warned of its futility. The assault resulted in a staggering loss of more than 6,000 Confederate soldiers.
And there's something to be said for the fact that sometimes you have to make important command decisions, but other times you need to listen to your subordinates and what they're telling you.
In the aftermath, Lee's defenders sought to shift blame to General James Longstreet, accusing him of poorly executing the attack.
You mean the guy who tried to tell you it was a terrible idea?
However, modern historians and military experts largely dismiss this claim as baseless, recognizing the plan itself was fatally flawed from the outset, regardless of its execution.
And Longstreet was an easy target in the post-war South in the world of the Lost Cause because Longstreet became a Republican, and to become a Republican was to be a traitor to the South. And he ended up serving in the administration of Rutherford B. Hayes as the minister to the Ottoman Empire. and he served in other roles as well. And late in his life, then he wrote a defense of his own military service that was somewhat negative toward Lee, and rightfully so.
The failure at Gettysburg marked a turning point in the war, one from which the South never recovered. Far from the actions of a master strategist, Lee's decisions at Gettysburg reveal a leader who was overconfident, out of touch with the battlefield realities, and unwilling to adapt his tactics.
Very good tactical general, not a great strategist.
Lee's leadership style also leaves much to be desired. While he is often lauded for inspiring loyalty among his troops, he was a terrible delegator. He often refused to allow his subordinates to take the initiative, and they could only act on his orders. He frequently delegated critical responsibilities to subordinates without proper, clear instructions.
I was going to say, you can't both say he didn't delegate, but then also say he delegated without clear instructions. I think the latter is more accurate, and a lot of people point to the fact that often he had gotten used to giving kind of vague, broad-stroked instructions to a guy like Stonewall Jackson because he knew that Jackson could take that and run with it, but not everybody could. And that is a flaw in Lee for sure, but I wouldn't argue that he wasn't willing to delegate.
A habit that led to confusion and mismanagement on the battlefield. For example, Lee's miscommunication with General Edward Ewell during the Battle of Gettysburg was a costly mistake. On July 1st,
Richard Ewell, but yeah.
Lee ordered Ewell to seize Cemetery Hill if practicable, leaving the directive ambiguous. Ewell, hesitant and lacking decisiveness, chose not to attack.
I would argue it wasn't practicable and that Ewell probably made the right decision.
This allowed Union forces to fortify the position overnight, creating a nearly impenetrable stronghold that became the backbone of their defense. The romanticization of Lee as a noble and honorable leader owes much to the post-war efforts of the Lost Cause movement.
Yep.
This ideology, propagated by organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, sought to recast the Confederacy's defeat as a valiant struggle against overwhelming odds. Central to this narrative was the elevation of Lee as a symbol of Southern virtue.
Yep.
Statues, schools, and streets were named in his honor, and textbooks were rewritten to portray him as a near mythical figure. But in reality, his military career was marred by strategic miscalculation and over-reliance on offensive tactics, unsustainable losses, and poor leadership.
And I would argue that Lee, again, as I said at the beginning, was a very good general. But I do believe that he does get propped up by the Lost Cause mythology that existed for a century or more afterwards. And it's just now being kind of deconstructed. And the unfortunate consequence of that is that when you push back against 100 years of Lost Cause narrative, you're seen as being some revisionist historian rather than someone who's just trying to set the record straight to where it should have been in the first place. It's that same narrative that argued that Grant was not a good general. He was just a butcher who just bludgeoned the South to death. Lee was this great general who just couldn't survive against the overwhelming numbers of Grant's army, rather than recognizing that Grant was a brilliant strategist who also had flaws. So that was really interesting, and I would say that 90% of what he said I agreed with, and I expressed where I didn't. But I thought that was really well done, and it was good enough that I definitely would like to check out some more of his stuff. So go over and check out the channel and let me know what you think, and if you see a particular video you think I should check out, let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.